It's 2 o'clock and we'll start with the PMS BLACKETT Memorial Lecture by Prof. Blundell. I would request Professor Sood to introduce Professor Blundell and then request him to give the talk. Thank you so much.
Welcome to this post-lunch session. PMS BLACKETT Memorial Lecture was established in 2011 in our academy. The award is given once in 3 years, alternately with the Jagdish Chandra Bose Memorial Lecture to a scientist of international repute in any branch of science. The first award, announced in 2013, was given to Professor Paul Nurse of UK. We are very delighted that recipient of this award this year is Professor Blundell. There will be a detailed introduction in a sense when our Vice President reads the citation, but I'll briefly mention that Professor Blundell is a structural biologist and science administrator. So he has played in both the roles exemplary, and he has contributed very significantly to structural biology of polypeptide hormones and many other related areas. He has authored more than 650 papers with over 16,000 citations, and he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 1984 and Foreign Fellow of the Indian National Science Academy a few years later. And he was recognized by knighthood in 1997. Without taking too much time, I'll request Professor Blundell to give his award lecture titled Structural Biology, Bioinformatics and Drug Discovery.
First, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come here, and even more, thank you for the honour of giving the PMS BLACKETT Memorial Lecture. So I'm an Indian lover. I've been coming here for more than 40 years. I've studied the Veena in southern India, and I've given already 5 different lectures here this year. So I feel I'm part of India, and it's really fantastic to be here. So today my lecture is going to be a story of contributions. I'm going to talk about the basic science in structural biology and bioinformatics, but I'm going to focus on drug discovery. And I thought I would start off in the middle of my career when we founded just 20 years ago a company called Aztecs. And the idea of this company was that we would take very small fragments of drug-like molecules, and we would have a library of around 1,000 compounds. Now, if you have a smaller compound, you can explore biochemical space much more efficiently than with a large library. With drug-like compounds, and I'm growing one here, from a fragment to a drug-like compound. For drug-like compounds, I would need many, many more compounds, really hundreds of millions. But I can explore chemical space effectively with these very small compounds. So we discussed this idea, and I discussed it with an Indian. This is Haran Jyoti, and Haran Jyoti left the Punjab when he was young. He was one of 3 Punjabis that joined my group in the 1980s, and we had many discussions. My lab was generally left-wing, but out of that left-wing environment, we formed 3 companies with all with Punjabi Indians, the most enterprising people I've had in my laboratory. This was in 1999, and Haran had been in my laboratory in the 1980s and then joined Glaxo, where he was making a good career. But we were friends and we used to discuss things at weekends, and we had the idea of using these very small fragments. And we thought, to begin with, we'd try steaming them in crystals and to see whether we could see the fragments, very tiny ones. Most people thought we couldn't see them, and we would then elaborate them if we could. In order to do that, we needed a chemist, and this is Chris Abel. Chris Abel is now Pro-Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University. He's in charge of all research. But when we were talking together and working together, he was a fairly young and very enterprising scientist. So we put forward the idea, and I put forward it to another student. My career has been based on the success of my students, and this was a student of the 1970s who had become a person who had large funds in a fund called the Abingworth. And so I went to him and asked for funds, and he said, "Tom, I think this is a very bad idea. I'll just give you $500,000. That may seem to be a lot of money, but in terms of running a company, it will last about half a year." So I got 3 people, 2 in my lab and 1 in Chris's lab. And at the beginning, Haran stayed in Glaxo, but then he moved to my lab briefly. And we then showed that this scheme worked. And eventually, and I'm now talking about the next 10 years, we got 80 employees. We reproduced the multidisciplinary lab that I had and Chris had, and I stayed as a non-executive, but Haran risked his career on it. He's very rich now, I should say, but he took the risk. And after some time, we built a building on the Science Park, and we built up to not from just 80 employees to 150 employees, and we got drugs onto the clinical pipeline. But in 2012, we had around 8 drugs in clinical trials, but then it gets very expensive. You need to have collaborations with large companies, and if you want to develop them all the way yourself, you need to have funding from a rich company. And so I negotiated, and we negotiated, and in 2013, we sold the company for 886 million, quite a lot of money, seeing we just had drugs in clinical trials. The Japanese company called Otsuka was very special for me, because if you get bought by a Western pharmaceutical company, they will inevitably take all your ideas and close you down. If that happens, I would have had 150 people out of a job. But this company promised to keep us together and use us as a demonstration, because our culture is quite a different one, and I'll tell you about that later. But in the next few years, we first got, in November 2016, a USD filing for 1 new drug, and this was for advanced breast cancer. And in March 2017, in a collaboration with Novartis, who paid for the later stage clinical trials, we got it on the market. That drug is now selling towards billions of dollars in the market, and hopefully it's solving some breast cancer troubles for many people. So 2 years later, in other words, earlier this year, we had another success, and we got, in collaboration with Janssen, another one of our drugs that we developed entirely in my company, and this one is just going on to the market this year. I've got one other being fast-tracked and 5 in clinical trials. So that's the end of the story, but I want to go back and tell you about the beginning and how a left-wing academic like myself could end up selling a company for nearly $1 billion and getting drugs on the market when I'm still an academic. So let me go back. I'll tell you about some of the ideas I've had about human, and I'll speak about microbacterial genomes and the proteomes. I'll show you how we need to understand the genomes and the proteomes in terms of the protein structures, and this is just the largest single-chain protein structure that anyone solved, which we did in my lab with Wellcome Trust funding. You need to make databases, and so you need to have computational capabilities, and we need to be able to use those in the evaluation of druggability, which we do. And so we have databases of small molecules bound to proteins. I should say these are all absolutely accessible. Anyone can use them. Nothing is patented. But from this process, and the one I just told you about, and others that I tried earlier on, we have drug candidates. And of course, the problem with drug candidates in cancer and in mycobacterial infections, like tuberculosis or leprosy, for example, is you get the emergence of resistance. And this is a typical case in one target of the drug. Each one of these points are places where the drug has led to resistance mutations. And you'll notice that they're all over the place. They're not all immediately contacting the drug. So we need to understand that. And so what I've been doing recently is developing a lot of software over the last 6 years, of course with other people's help, and I'll show you all the pictures of the other people in a moment, how those mutations affect the drug resistance. And I just wanted to be in the modern time frame because all of us now are using machine learning, and I've done that with the help of colleagues. We have a machine learning program that observes the mutations in terms of the structure, and we can predict where they are, and I can think then about designing new drugs before they go on the market, which are less likely to be resistant. So that's the framework of what I'm going to talk about. But I want to go back to the history in this Blackett Memorial Lecture, and really the people who started me in my career were J.D. Bernal, whose books I read when I was a student, and then I discovered the person who started working with him in 1934, I think it was, and that is Dorothy Hodgkin. And Dorothy Hodgkin and J.D. Bernal saw these crystals, and they put them in an X-ray beam, and they didn't diffract. And then J.D. Bernal realized that you had to have water around them, and so he put them in a capillary like this, and they diffracted like this. And so in 1934, J.D. Bernal and Dorothy Hodgkin realized there was a future. They said now a crystalline protein has been made to give X-ray photographs it's clear that we have the means of checking them by examining the crystal structure of crystalline proteins and arriving at more detailed conclusions. And they sent this to Nature, and it was published in 2 weeks' time. The only problem was that this didn't get finished for another 35 years. They got the idea right, but the timescales were ambitious. And so 30 years after this date, I joined Dorothy Hodgkin's lab. So here she was in the 1930s, and she, in 1934, had gone from section crystals to pick up these crystals, and she was a left-wing interest in politics. Her husband was a member of the Communist Party, but very early on, she went to Beecham's, and these crystals were from industry. So Dorothy Hodgkin always had a left-wing view, but always a tolerance and an interaction with companies. So that's where I learned these ways of operating. But I joined the lab in the 1960s. That diffraction pattern had been available for over 30 years. And then eventually we solved the structure of insulin, and it was 1969 before it was published. This gives me the first one of my lessons from Dorothy Hodgkin, and that was that good science requires a long-term vision. And I show you a picture here. Some of you may have seen it in my previous lectures. So here's Dorothy Hodgkin when she started the project, and here's Dorothy Hodgkin a little bit after we solved the structure, but only a few years. And all of that time, she'd been working on insulin. In the meantime, she got the Nobel Prize, of course, in 1964 for penicillin and other things. But those of you who've seen my talk before will realize that this is me. And you will also realize that I wanted to show you this to demonstrate how beautiful I was over 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. So this is life and growing older. So what, of course, I did was to join a group which was multinational. So my second lesson from Dorothy Hodgkin and from working on insulin is that science was international and interdisciplinary. And this was the team I joined. And so this guy is New Zealand, this lady Australia, this lady UK, of course Dorothy UK. This was Liang Chun-Chai, who was the first Chinese, I think, to travel abroad to do structural biology. And you will all recognize this as Vijay, I think very much involved in INSA in the past, and of course very sadly very unwell at the moment. We're all trying to see him as often as we can. He's still going into the lab though. And this is Ted Baker from New Zealand, and these other pictures are just pictures of us at the time. So it's interdisciplinary is the second message, and many of the scientists in Dorothy's lab were from India. And so this is Dorothy with a number of people, some of whom I hope you recognize, including Vijay and Kalyani, who are well, here's Kalyani, I think. There's Siv Ramasation, his wife, Kosolia, and of course Siv was a very great influence on my interactions with India over the years. And here's Vijay and myself. I think this is in the mid-70s, so I've been coming already for a few years. And we became very close friends when we come back and continue to interact. But I wanted to show you one other picture. And this is Carnatic music with Krishna Raghavendra. And of course, apart from my interest in politics, I spent my nights playing modern jazz. And I came very early to India, and I studied with Krishna Raghavendra, the Veena. So I'm one of the few Western scientists, I guess, who's tried to play the Veena. I continued my lessons when I got back to Oxford, and I'm absolutely a fan of Carnatic music. So I hope, and of course that's down south, and that's what I go and listen whenever I can. But we also travelled to China in very early days in the 70s. Here's Dorothy, I'm at the back there, and Niantam Chai's there, and here we are all posing. And this is me giving a lecture. In China in the 1970s, almost nobody could speak English. And so this is a very wonderful lady who could translate my lecture. And there's a picture of Mao above me. And everybody was wearing Mao suits. And they asked me to entertain them afterwards. In those days, I used to be able to do that. The only instrument we could find that I could play in China at that time was a guitar, although I was a trumpeter most of the time. And you could see that the Chinese were all smiling. I'm not sure whether they were embarrassed or whether they were enjoying it, but I hope they were enjoying it greatly. And so this were the lessons from Dorothy. But there was another lesson from Dorothy, as you can see from my earlier comments, that Dorothy, in the 1960s, when I was in the laboratory and working on insulin and diabetes, we got these crystals from Nova, Wellcome, and Eli Lilly. And so, for a left-wing socialist, I was actually running the city of Oxford as a left-wing Labour councillor, as well as playing my modern jazz in the middle of the nights. I found myself going to these companies. So when I finished my time with Dorothy, I thought, I've got lots of friends in companies, and I started interacting with them. So the first thing I did was to go from pepsin to renin, which is a homologue, and this is the structure, and that's involved in lowering blood pressure. And I set up, even in the late 70s, collaborations with these labs. And eventually, I published the structure of renin. I had a lot of trouble because many of the crystallographers thought that my collaborations with industry were a distraction, and I should focus on my crystallography. But I compounded the problem by speculating, and this is, I think, one of the first ideas about structural biology and drug discovery. This is my model of renin, and you can see we know the substrate which fits into the binding cleft. We could define the pockets where the side chains that you can see along this chain are binding, and we determine all the hydrogen bonds. And so in the late 70s, I devised what I think is now generally called structure-guided drug discovery, where we try to reproduce these interactions with a drug molecule. But there was a distraction, and that was this. Here is my model of pepsin and renin, and I was looking at it, and after about a year of looking at it, and I suppose you've all seen this already, it's in two halves, and actually the fold of this half and this half are the same. And so I went to Nature and I published the idea that there was an ancestor of this protein. So this was Nature in 1978. Max Prutz was very angry with me on this. He said, Tom, go back to the lab, do something real, stop speculating. So in the week, I did what he said. I did the experiments, but on Saturday mornings, I looked for this. I thought, where is this? Is it still around? Or did it just evolve by gene duplication and linking into this? Is it still there? And so every Saturday morning I looked for it, but it took me 6 years to find it. And where did I find it? I found it in the sequence of the HIV genome. So in 1984, as you know, HIV being a very small genome, I think they thought there were 10 genes there, became sequenced. It was short, so they could do that. And I spotted right in there the protease in the middle of what had been labeled the pol gene. And I saw the sequence I was looking for, and I then speculated that there was a protease there. And that made sense, because this was a polyprotein, the product of this gene, and if it was going to be cleaved, we needed a protease. And so I built models of it, and we suggested that the HIV put this polyprotein in, and it then went into the virus, and as that virus was being pushed out of the human cell, then, of course, the target protein needed to be activated. And what we could say was, if it had two polypeptides, they would come together, and only when they came together would that protease be activated. And so I speculated that that was what was happening, but I was a little more cautious. We built models, and actually two people in my lab actually published one of them, although we built the models in 1981. But I decided I'd best to do the crystal structure and not any more speculation. But we were right. This was the target in HIV. So this was the relative of angiotensinogen cleaving enzyme. And so I went to Pfizer and I said to them, try your agents that bind to angiotensin converting enzyme and try them in HIV. They thought I was crazy going from an antihypertensive to HIV, and they worked. And so that then became the basis of drug discovery for HIV. And in a very quick time, in many companies started working on it, and I did as well. There was molecules that came from industry. In 1995, so a very short time, they began to have a drug against AIDS, HIV. And we published that then. But the problem then was that I got distracted because, to my surprise, although I was a left-wing Labour councillor, Margaret Thatcher asked me to come and work with her in Number 10. And then I found that I couldn't have any collaboration with the company because I was a member of government. So anyway, that led to drugs, and it also led to resistance. So that's the model of what I'm trying to tell you about. And the model is you go from gene to protein to new drug. And I call this one exploring biological space, and we're using genomics, as we did with HIV protease, to go from the gene to the target protein, and then we need the chemists to go from the protein to the drug. And so that's really exploring chemical space. So we're exploring biological and chemical space, very multidisciplinary topic. We need to have everybody in the group. So what do we do? Well, what I did always was to take a project that I was working on in academia and see whether I could do something in translational. So this is called non-homologous end joining. It's when your DNA gets broken, both strands, and it has a number of steps. I haven't time to go through them, but a number of proteins come in and bind to them, and then eventually a ligase repairs. The first lesson I learned from this was that this complex system needs a lot of different techniques. So I needed small angle X-ray scattering, I certainly needed computational analysis, and I got enough courage a year or two ago to publish a paper on Science predicting other members of this system. And then the X-ray was a huge problem. I worked for quite a few years to get this structure, which was pretty low resolution, and I published it in Nature in 2010. But then I had to get it high resolution, so just 2 years later, I published a much better resolution structure of this huge protein, 4,000 amino acids. I'm showing you this because I want to tell you, if you're not already aware, of the resolution revolution. This took me 10 years, this took me 10 months. This is the cryo-EM structure of this. It's changed my life, it's changed structural biologists' life. We're all solving structures now with cryo-EM, and it's taking much less time. And of course we use other techniques like nanostrainer spectrometry. So the X-ray, not got time to go through it, 4,128 amino acids. I solved it by substituting cellular methionine and doing it by anomalous scattering. But with cryo-EM, what we did is you just put your particles on a grid, and you have to have preferably a Titan Cryos, but some of these smaller machines are also okay. The revolution in cryo-EM came from two things. One were the new detectors, and the other was the new software. This all occurred around 5 or 6 years ago, and so you could see this is the structure from cryo-EM, and this is the structure from X-ray. This is 10 years, this is the 10 months. And this is just what has happened. A Chinese group, a very good group, including several friends of mine from Shanghai and Beijing, solved this structure at 6.6 angstrom, and here's the structure that we've got. This very talented lady just got this structure. Now this is not just the structure of the DNA PK, this kinase, but this is a complex of 3 different amino acids, not at very high resolution, but done very, very quickly. So we're beginning now to get the complexes at a resolution where we can be fairly sure of the sequence. What the Chinese did was to fit our model and sequence to their cryo-EM, but it was really much lower resolution. So this is changing the way we see things, and what we see is structures. My 2 X-ray structures of it showed that this was a conformational changing system, and if I added something down here, the kinase was up there, and that kinase will be changed. But when we compare the APO structure with the complex I just told you about, then you get a huge conformational change. So here's the kinase at the top, only 300 amino acids. All of this other equipment here, another 4,000 amino acids or so, is all of that is about regulation. And all the other members of the family sit on here and regulate it. And so this is where cell and structural biology is at the moment. Complex systems, regulatory systems. There are 12 different components about this. Now we do structure, but we need not only space, but we need time. And so we've been collaborating with a guy called Terence Strick, who's a US-French guy. He's now at the Institut Jacques Monod in Paris. And what you do is you take a magnetic bead, you put some DNA here, you connect it with another piece of DNA, have another DNA connected to the bottom. So here are the 2 ends of my broken DNA. And then we add all of these components, the DNA, PKCS, and others. And as we add them, we see it change in its position. So we can now use this magnetic trap system, not only to get the structure, which we've already got, but to look at the time zone. So structural biologists tend to look at structures, we can now look at the way they change over time. This, again, was published just a couple of years ago. I don't seem to have a date on here, but it was just 2 years ago in Nature Structural and Molecular Biology. But the problem is, that all took us 10 years, and the question is, how do we do things quickly? Because if I'm doing a drug discovery, I've got 20,000 plus genes in the human, and even if I take a simple system like mycobacterium, like tuberculosis, I've still got around 4,000. Now here we know a very tiny number of the protein structures of the 20,000 genes. Even in tuberculosis, where there's been a huge amount of investment, we only have 600 or so with defined three-dimensional structures out of 4,000 genes. So what we've been doing is to use software that we've developed to model others. Now, this is a very contentious area because structural biologists, as I've explained, are very skeptical of what I call knowledge-based prediction. But with INSA AGM, my wife actually, Mike Sternberg and Janet Thornton, we published in 1987, so over 30 years ago, the idea of knowledge-based structure prediction. And then over that year and the coming years, I started developing software which would take knowledge from homologs and rebuild it into the structure of the target protein. So my first program was Composer. That's got 1,000 citations. But this one here, which we published in '93, so a few years later, this takes these structures and it looks at interrelationships between these, and it builds a model using that information as restraints. And so that is called modeler. It's the satisfaction of spatial restraints. And then, so you have homologs, but you need to align the sequences of the homologs with your target protein. And to do that, you have to project the structures of the known proteins onto sequence. So here's another bit of software. This is done less well, only 1,400 citations, but that takes a structure and it projects it onto a sequence so that you can relate sequence to structure, which is going to be important when you're modeling when you only have a sequence. You actually need to go from sequence to structure, of course. And then we've had some other software. This was by some young things. You can see that I try to influence my musical interest, composer, fugue, and rapper for young things, onto my software. You can see, though, that my most successful person, Andre Shelley, who was elected to the American Academy just last year, he refused to call it after a musical term. The only concession he made was to write modeler with 2 L's to make sure it came from England. So, of course, the American form has 1 L. And so what we do is we take this sequence to structure homology recognition, and then we build models for all of the gene products in the genome. And this is what we did for tuberculosis. You can see this guy, Bernardo, from Mexico, agreed to call this program Chopin, another musical term. And what that does is to model. So we did this quite a few years ago now, and out of the 4,000 gene products, we got around 70% models which were fairly good, some ones which were likely, and some which were really guesses. But most of them proved pretty successful. So we've then gone through mycobacteria, modeling using updated software, various other mycobacteria. Mycobacterium abscessus is the one that infects the lungs of cystic fibrosis patients, and I've been doing a lot of work on that as well. And so we've been trying to use my experience with tuberculosis to target this, and so there are only 39 out of around 5,000, actually 4,940 genes, but we've been able to model that. I just make another point here. This guy's Polish, this lady is from the Gambia in Africa, this guy is from Brazil, and this guy is from Romania. We have a very multidisciplinary and also multinational team. And here's our latest interest, and this is really been started by this guy who came to me when I was giving a lecture in Colorado with the American Leprosy Mission and wanted to work on leprosy. You may not know that the leprosy genome is very similar to the tuberculosis one. Nobody talks about the number of lepers that we have in many countries, including India. People tend to be put in leper colonies, leper hospitals, and really left everywhere in the world. And this is a map here. You can see India, parts of Africa, and quite a lot in Brazil of leprosy people. And so what has been done is we've been transferring tuberculosis drugs over, and the genome is much smaller, although on the average around 95% identical. So that's what we've been doing there. Then just to say something about the cancer, we've also been going through the cancer gene census of humans, trying to model those. And this is a very quick overview. And in what we call the cancer gene census, there's just over 700 genes that are likely to have driver mutations that lead to cancer. And so what we've been doing is also using the computational methods to model these. We've not published this yet, but we've got models for all of these. And then we use new software, and I'll talk a bit more about this, to predict the effects of mutations. Now, to predict the effects of mutations in cancer and in resistance, we first, 22 years ago, published a paper that looked at the thermodynamic cycle and looked at the wild-type mutant unfolded, the wild-type folded, and the mutant. And we looked at the probabilities of each of these occurring on a statistical basis. And this is the formula that we derived, which tells you about the probability of a mutation occurring in the unfolded and in the folded state. And this software has been available for some time, but it's been updated recently by this very talented Indian from Chennai. I met him in 2007. He came to UK, and he updated the program we'd originally written in '97 and is now looking after it. So if anybody wants to use it, you can contact him. He's in the laboratory in microbiology in Cambridge. But being modern, we've also used the machine learning approach, and I can't go into this in detail, but we have a much cruder molecule of the model of the protein, and we have just an 8-dimensional vector which describes the amino acid change. And then we just do a usual machine learning approach. I was very skeptical about it, and this idea came from this guy who'd been doing machine learning and just when it was really getting popular in 2013, and he joined my lab. I asked him to improve the other program. He said he didn't want to do that, and then I suddenly realized he wanted to do machine learning. So I thought we'd try it on this system, and I was very skeptical. But machine learning works better, even though the model we use to describe the protein is much more simplistic. And this is all available on the web, and all published if anybody wants to use it. And we have different flavors: protein stability, protein-protein interactions, protein nucleic acid interactions, and you can predict the effects of all of these. So what we can do is we can take cancers and we can look at the mutations, and what we find is many of the proteins in cancers are actually multi-protein complexes, and we can look at the mutations, and very often the mutations that cause cancer are way away from the functional groups. They're in the protein-protein interaction regions. So that's what we do. Now we want to move from chemical space to chemical space, and there we need to use crystallography, and we've been very dependent on all these machines, automated data collection at Diamond and other synchrotrons. I think I better move on a bit quicker. And so what we're doing now is we're taking the fragment, and this is the protein structure, and we're defining where that small fragment that I mentioned at the beginning is binding. When it binds, it usually binds with millimolar binding, and we can look at the structure, and then we get the chemists, the computer people, and the structural biologists together, and we suggest, well, you change it like this will give a better fit, and we can usually get very significant changes. So you've got a multidisciplinary group sitting around the computer, elaborating your fragments, and we've done this probably around 50 times now. We can go from a fragment to a drug-like molecule, which is binding nanomolar quite often, in about 100 steps or less, and we can get a nanomolar binder. So that's the method that we use in Aztecs to make our cancer drugs. But then Bill Gates arrived in our lab, well, in my company first, and asked us to work on tuberculosis. And also the Wellcome Trust came, and they sold their interests in companies, and so could do some drug discovery. So the Wellcome Trust wanted me to work on complex multi-protein systems relevant to cancer, and Bill Gates wanted to work with the Gates Foundation on neglected diseases. So what I've done over the last few years is to suddenly become a hopeful, more expert, but more knowledgeable, not an expert, on these diseases. So tuberculosis, as you know, you've got first-line drugs, but the problem is you've got multiple drug-resistant sperm. So there are two approaches to drug resistance. One is to make another drug quickly, and the other is to understand the process, and I want to tell you about both of these. Let me talk about tuberculosis, and this is a plot of where tuberculosis is a problem. And I remember talking to Melinda Gates, and she told me why Bill Gates got interested in this. It's because she was watching the television, and it showed in Africa all these people dying of tuberculosis, a huge number. And she said to Bill, why can't we do something with our money about it? Amazing. And Bill apparently rushed off to the computer and studied the situation, and then came back and said, Melinda, you're right. We're going to form the Gates Foundation. We're going to work on tuberculosis. And that was important to me. Some of you have seen this picture. This is Zimbabwe, where TB is quite prevalent. And this is my wife. My wife has been nearly 40 years in the UK, 35 years working on the science. She's had a next paper every 5 years. But here are my two daughters, one from Oxford with a first in medicine, and one from London School of Economics with a first in economics and law. But here are my nephew or grandnephew and niece living in this beautiful country with one of their family died of tuberculosis. So suddenly this whole area became personal for me because I spent a lot of time there. And so what we did is we looked at the first-line drugs, the second-line drugs, and then we began to use the techniques we use for cancer. So that means doing a fragment screen, we use thermal shift, NMR, surface plasma resonance. We obviously have to do biochemistry on the protein, and we have to update our chemical library. And then we need a team. In all the teams working on these areas, Indians have been very important. So here's Sachin Surari. He led the team in up to around 5 years ago. He's now working in industry. I'm afraid in the Cambridge area. I managed to get him back. This guy is from Portugal. This is the lady from Africa. But this is Pooja Gupta. I met her in Chandigarh. She's actually from Delhi. And she's just started to do a PhD. She's done a master's in my lab. But a multidisciplinary group, very much dependent on Indian skills. We use all these biophysical methods to screen the fragments. And then once we've got a fragment bind, we do the structure with X-ray or NMR, and then we do the thermodynamics with ITC, and then the kinetics with SPR. And so we get pictures like this. This is section again, all the fragments. And you can see out of these fragments, in this case, you could, even if you're not a chemist, design a drug from where all those are binding. But we do it a little bit more systematically than that. And here's Bill. I suddenly got a message from Bill Gates saying he wanted to come and spend a day with us. And I said, fine. But then he said, don't tell the Vice Chancellor of the university because he'll kidnap me. I want to come to your university, your lab, and I don't want anyone to know. So he came on his own. Here's me and here's Chris. Somebody already found out that he was coming. I got him in the lab. I made him put a lab coat on. I think it's the first time Bill Gates ever put a lab coat on, I suspect. And here he is, in very Bill Gates style, having a discussion. He's asking that student. He's saying, you know, Bill Gates has done a lot of work on water. He's interested in water structure. And he was saying to this student, and the picture's behind me up here, he's saying, well, where are all the waters? The waters around proteins. And my student here was very bright, but he said, Mr. Gates, I've taken out all the waters so you can see my new drug. Very good answer. And I had to show him waters later. And of course what we do is to take that, cycle it round, and then we gradually get, with the chemist, a drug-like molecule. These days we're doing it all with cryo-EM, and cryo-EM we can see very beautifully. You see this is a heme group, but we can also see these little fragments. In this case it's actually the drug isoniazid, and you can begin to see where they are. This was the first results that Azman Wadir, who's actually from Pakistan, and Amanda Chaplin, who's a postdoc, did. So we can even trace the fragments at high resolution. And then we do a lot of software. I haven't time to describe this. This is about hotspots. Fragments bind in hotspots. And so we re-simulated in the computer the process of binding a fragment. And if you just do it where it would like to bind, we have 3 fragments in the computer, and you get red, blue, and yellow for the donor, the acceptor, and the hydrophobic ligands. But that's just the thermodynamics. Somehow I've got to simulate the entropy, and that's something I'm still trying to do properly. But what we've done is to simulate it using various functions of depth. But this is a software. You can get it, it's completely accessible, anybody can run it. And if you run it, you will see where the fragment binds. The fragment will bind to a hotspot, and if you've got a hotspot, you won't get a small molecule binding. So this software, you can take all the proteins in our databases and look and see where they would bind the fragment and how druggable they'd be. So here's a picture showing the relationship between the fragment binding and and I put this in mainly to show not only another Indian, Sherin Thomas from Kerala, absolutely brilliant lady, and then Andres Floto is the clinician. Now we've also done this with cancer. I see my chair is standing up. I start with a molecule I've published, this one in Nature. We can see little pockets. I use various fragment-based methods and others, but what I can do here is to show you this is the structure that I defined and published in Nature some time ago, and show you how important these two spots are. And I can show that this is a hot spot. And then what I can do is to do fragment binding to this, and very soon get something that goes down to nanomolar. The real trouble in cancer with multi-protein systems, and of course we were talking about tuberculosis and other drugs this morning in the session, you can't get companies to put money into developing them. And the big trouble for tuberculosis is not designing the drugs, it's funding the clinical trials. And it's the same for these very complex systems. And then, of course, resistance, we've got all this software, and now so we run, we've seen this before, the statistical methods. We've developed new machine learning methods to look at the impacts of mutations on ligand binding. This is all available, and we can then look at mutations occurring in any protein. Some of them are obvious, they're very close to the ligand, but others, like this one, you see, here's the ligand, and these mutations, I can predict that they will stop binding here using our software. So it's allosteric effects quite often. And so what we've been doing now is thinking about where all these mutations occur. And if the university doesn't throw me out, I'm 10 years past retirement, and they keep threatening to do so, what I'm going to do is to try and cope with this by repurposing, and also I'm interested in interfacial stabilizers. So the whole design against resistance, and starting off by using this software to predict whether resistance mutations are going to occur is absolutely critical. But I want to end with another lesson from Dorothy Hodgkin, and that is you need a multidisciplinary team. I try to keep my team with as many different nationalities, Poland, African, Indian, Chinese, Portuguese, Brazilian, Indian again, Czech, and so on. It's not balanced. I've only got 2 English people here, but it's internationally balanced. But the other thing is I've tried to keep it gender balanced. Now you can see if you count this up, I've got around 40% women in the team. I was looking through the prizes that you've given to your young investigators. It's much less than that. I think I want to just tell you that some of my women are Indian or Pakistan and Indian. Indian women are pretty good, and I've been trying to keep the balance. But you can see I'm mostly dependent on this lady. This is my wife. She did all the work on the DNA PK, and she's been an inspiration. But science must be international, it must be interdisciplinary, and I think it must be gender balanced. And I attribute all of this to Dorothy's group. She did it 50 years ago. I think we can do it now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for the very fascinating talk.
Good afternoon. So after this wonderful lecture exploring molecular and personal spaces with bindings and bondings, and it is my great pleasure to read the citation for the lecture award. PMS BLACKETT Memorial Lecture was established in 2011 from general funds of the Academy. The award is given once in 3 years alternatively with the Jagdish Chandra Bose Memorial Lecture to a scientist of international repute in any branch of science. The first award was announced in 2013. The lectureship for the year 2019 has been awarded to Professor Sir Tom Blundell, Foreign Fellow, Emeritus Professor and Director of Research, Department of Biochemistry, University of Cambridge, UK, for his notable contributions to the structural and computational biology of polypeptides, hormones, growth factors, receptor activation, signal transduction, and DNA double-strand break repair. Subjects important in cancer, tuberculosis, and familial diseases. Professor Blundell's research interests lie in elucidating the architecture and function of macromolecules, their multi-component assemblies, with the objectives of understanding biological function, of knowledge-based prediction of structure, and of discovering new therapeutics for cancer and tuberculosis. System studies including DNA repair, hormones, growth factors, and hormone receptor interactions, cellular signaling, crystallins for lens proteins, renin and HIV protease. He has contributed 235 crystal structures to the worldwide protein data bank. At least 7 of the molecule of the month featured in the RCSP site of the data bank have featured molecular structures solved and studied by the Blundell lab. His group has written several broadly used bioinformatics programs, including Modular and Fugue. He authored a textbook on protein crystallography with Louisa Johnson, which was translated into French and Russian. Professor Blundell is a Fellow of the Royal Society, elected in 1984. He has also served as a member of the PM Margaret Thatcher's Advisory Council on Science and Technology in 88 to 90. Founding CEO of Biotechnology and Biological Science Research Council 1991 to 96, and later its chair from 2009 to 2015. Chairman of the Royal Commission on Environment Pollution 1998 to 2005, Deputy Chair of Institute of Cancer Research 2008 to 2015, and President of UK Science Council 2011 to 2016. He was knighted for his outstanding contributions to science by the Queen of England. Professor Sir Tom Blundell was elected to the Foreign Fellowship of the Indian National Science Academy in the year 1995. Professor.
Sissy.